So for those who don't know about ResApp, ResApp is a digital healthcare company. We're focused on the diagnosis and management of respiratory disease. One of the key value propositions for ResApp is that we don't require any hardware, any accessories other than a smartphone. We have some very clever technology that was originally developed at the University of Queensland that's able to accurately diagnose and measure the severity of respiratory disease using the microphone that's built into the smartphone that you have in your pocket. We've been running the company now for just over 4 years, and we've really been building value in the company around the clinical trials and building the value around the clinical evidence to prove that what we do works. And so we've been running clinical trials. We've recruited over 6,000 patients, both here in Australia and the US. And we now have essentially 3 prospective double-blind clinical studies, the gold standard of clinical studies, with good results that we're now taking forward through regulatory agencies for regulatory approval. And I guess the prize at the end of this, at the end of regulatory approval, is what we believe to be a huge global market opportunity. We estimate that there's over 700 million doctor visits that result in a diagnosis of respiratory disease. And we have some really neat ways of accessing that market through telehealth, through emergency departments, and through urgent care clinics. Right now, the company is well set up. We're well funded to take ourselves through to commercialization, and that's really the next step on this journey. A little bit quickly about our capital structure. We're obviously ASX listed. We have a market cap just north of 100 million. In the bank, we have over $5 million of cash, and that's at least 18 months runway for us moving forward. We have a board of directors that include people with biotech background, with technology background, as well as healthcare IT. And we think we're uniquely positioned there in that crossover between healthcare and technology. Substantial shareholders have been with us for a long time. Our largest shareholder is Fidelity International. Their funds owning roughly 10% of ResApp. So talking a little bit about respiratory disease in general, respiratory disease is the most common outcome for someone to visit the doctor. As I said, estimates of 700 million plus doctor visits every year, resulting in a diagnosis of respiratory disease. Some of the major costs to the US health system or the global health system are because of respiratory disease. And what's really interesting about respiratory disease is that they're very varied. So you have an upper respiratory tract infection like a sore throat, runny nose, to the more severe cases like an asthma or pneumonia in the lower respiratory tract. Each of these diseases are treated very differently. So it's really important to get that diagnosis correct so that you can be treated and get better faster. Today, that diagnosis is done using a bunch of different tools. A lot of it is clinician experience and expertise. It's about using a stethoscope, a chest x-ray, blood tests, a whole suite of tests to make a diagnosis. As you can imagine, that can be time consuming. It can be expensive. And I think most important to realize is that it's actually not that accurate. In our clinical studies, we actually get a number of clinicians to look at each patient, and we found that those clinicians only agree with each other roughly 70% of the time. So roughly 3 in 10 times, those clinicians disagree on a diagnosis. So you can imagine that diagnosis is very subjective and not very accurate. Our technology is based on machine learning, artificial intelligence technology that was developed at the University of Queensland. It uses algorithms to diagnose these diseases based on cough sounds. So effectively, we use the phone, we use the smartphone, we use the microphone in the smartphone to record cough sounds, and then we provide a diagnosis based on signatures inside of that cough sound. An analogy I like to give is Shazam. Shazam listens to a snippet of music, tells you an artist and title. We listen to your cough sounds, and we match those cough sounds to particular diseases and provide a disease diagnosis based on that. So we essentially hold the phone about an arm's length away from the patient. We ask the patient to cough 5 times. We give immediate feedback that we've recorded 5 coughs. We ignore background talking, background noise, crying, all of those sort of other noises. We ask a few questions about the patient, the date of birth, whether they have a runny nose, and then provide then and there an instantaneous bedside, if you want, diagnosis of these respiratory diseases. So in this case, this patient has a lower respiratory tract disease that also has pneumonia. We've been focused for the last 4 years effectively on clinical studies. As I said, over 6,000 patients through our clinical studies, 3 key clinical studies that are pivotal, gold standard, double-blind, prospective clinical studies we've run here in Australia and the US. We have results in 90% plus agreement with, or 80% plus agreement with clinicians, sometimes 90%. In the US, it's a little bit lower. What we saw in the US was significantly more disagreement between clinicians. So we actually see differences in clinical behavior in the US versus Australia. But I guess in summary, across both children and adult, we've got results here that we're very happy to submit to regulatory agencies for approval. Our Australian results were recently published in a peer-reviewed medical journal, which gives us a great deal of credibility in the clinical community. And we've also submitted those for CE mark approval back in December 2018. Our US study results were presented at a major US respiratory physician conference earlier this year, and have also been submitted to the FDA for what's called a de novo approval, which we submitted in April of this year. Our Australian adult results will also be submitted for European approval later this year. So we've been focused primarily on clinical evidence and generating that clinical evidence, but what we've really seen as one of the other key factors for ResApp is bringing it to market. And we think we have a very unique opportunity to bring this technology to market in the fast-growing field of telehealth. So in telehealth, you're seeing a doctor via a video link. So it's a Skype chat with your general practitioner. And we see an opportunity here in that during that conversation, that clinician doesn't have access to a stethoscope. So they can't listen to your chest, which is really the first and the main diagnostic tool used to diagnose these respiratory diseases. So in the US, you get tens of millions, coming up to hundreds of millions of telehealth visits happening every year. In places like China, we see 500,000 telehealth visits per day. And during those consultations, that clinician can't use the stethoscope, so they can't listen to the chest, so they can't make an accurate diagnosis of respiratory disease. So ResApp solution connects in with that telehealth solution and is able to help those clinicians make an accurate diagnosis of respiratory disease while staying inside the telehealth consultation. And so that means we can help essentially increase the utilization of telehealth by dealing with these large percentage of respiratory disease cases. So there's a bunch of companies that are potential partners here, from companies like Teladoc, which is NASDAQ listed, to companies like Ping An, which is listed in Hong Kong, but is also doing 500,000 telehealth consultations per day. So telehealth is our primary target market opportunity, but over the last few years, we've had a significant amount of interest from emergency departments and urgent care clinics about, well, if we can use this technology here in our clinic, we can much faster, much more efficiently triage patients and get them the right care at the right time. So the second market opportunity for us is bringing this into the emergency department or in urgent care clinics, where speed is of the essence, where we can essentially triage patients in a waiting room, be able to put those patients with pneumonia into higher levels of care, while patients with an upper respiratory tract infection can be sent home for rest. So it's able to triage those patients and get them the right level of care, which results in the right level of cost as well. Imagine a pneumonia patient going through an ED is a much more expensive situation than sending someone home for bed rest based on an upper respiratory tract infection. We've also been broadening our product portfolio over the years, using this idea of taking cough sounds or sound-based diagnosis to a number of different disease areas. We've focused initially on pediatric and adult acute respiratory diagnosis. We've moved into asthma and COPD chronic disease management, and we've also moved into obstructive sleep apnea. And so I've got some slides on those moving forward. But as you can see, we've got a pipeline that has a number of clinical studies coming through, a number of regulatory submissions coming through, and soon a number of commercialization opportunities coming soon. So chronic disease management is essentially, there are two main respiratory diseases, which are chronic diseases, which people need to manage day in, day out for the rest of their lives. Roughly 1 in 7 children have asthma. Roughly 1 in 5 adults above 45 have COPD. So these people need to manage their disease. They're often given different tools. They're given questionnaires. They're given spirometers, all sorts of different tools to try to help them manage their disease better. We think there's an opportunity here to provide them with a tool that is on their smartphone that they have with them 24/7, that's able to better help them manage their disease. By better help them manage the disease, it means identify when they're having an exacerbation, when they need to use medication. Has that medication worked? Are they heading down the path to more strong interventions? And so we've got the ability, or we're demonstrating the ability through our clinical studies, that we're able to help these patients identify what's going on and hopefully get them treatment, a better level of treatment. So sleep apnea is one of those diseases where we've been very interested over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've run some initial clinical studies to demonstrate that we can do some really interesting diagnostic tests using sound for sleep apnea. So sleep apnea, some of you may have heard of ResMed being the pioneers in the therapy of sleep apnea. Sleep apnea is one of those unknown diseases unless you have it. People who have sleep apnea often will get onto a ResMed therapy and will change their life completely. They will get, they will feel 100, 200 times better during the day. Roughly 3 in 10 men and roughly 2 in 10 women have sleep apnea. And the sad thing about this is roughly 80% of those people who have sleep apnea don't know that they have sleep apnea. And the problem here is that if you're untreated and you have sleep apnea, you have a significantly higher risk of death due to heart disease, you have stroke risk, you have type 2 diabetes. It's a significant health issue. It's not just that you snore, it's that you stop breathing when you sleep, and that causes significant health issues. The problem with being diagnosed with sleep apnea, and this is really what has been a challenge for, since the early days of ResMed, has been to be diagnosed with sleep apnea today requires a visit through a sleep laboratory. So it requires you going into an unfamiliar, uncomfortable environment in a hospital, being wired up with roughly a dozen sensors, measuring the brain, measuring your movement, measuring your airflow out of your nose, and then trying to get asleep that night, having a sleep doc, then review all of that data and provide a diagnosis. The best step forward that people have had is bringing that test at home, which still means you're wired up with a bunch of cables. You still have to sleep with these cables stuck up your nose, and it's still an expensive referral-driven business. The testing of sleep apnea today is not a scalable solution to mass screen those 3 in 10 men who have sleep apnea. So our solution is replacing all of that cabling, all of that test, with simply a smartphone placed on a bedside table. Essentially, you go to sleep, you press start on the smartphone records the noises that you make overnight. So it records your breathing sounds, it records your snoring sounds, and then we look for signatures in those sounds that help us diagnose sleep apnea. And so what we've done is we run a trial where we recruited roughly 600 patients in a sleep laboratory. We wired them up with the 12 cables, put a smartphone on the bedside table, recorded their sleep sounds. We did their full polysonography, the full 12 cable sleep lab. We got a result for that. We got a result for looking at just the audio. And we're getting accuracy rates of above 80%. So if you compare this accuracy rate to what they get with an in-home study versus an in-lab study, it's about the same. So we're just as accurate as that in-home study with a smartphone placed on a bedside table. So this really changes the game for sleep apnea diagnosis and sleep apnea screening. It now means we've got a tool that we can potentially put in everybody's home to be able to screen them for sleep apnea and then get them onto therapy, remove those long-term health risks of sleep apnea. Our next step in our development process here is doing this at home. So as I said, our clinical trial to date has been, we've done it in the sleep lab where we've put the patient with the traditional sleep testing and the phone beside the bed. We're now sending patients home with the phone. We're sending patients home with traditional in-home sleep testing and doing the same comparison in the home setting. We've recruited over 200 patients to date. We're targeting roughly 250, and we expect those results this quarter. So that's really the next big milestone for our sleep apnea program, because we need to demonstrate that it works in the home, because that's our ultimate intended use environment. So, just finally, we've been at this now for 4 years. We haven't seen anyone else in the world doing what we do. To be able to diagnose and manage these diseases just using the smartphone, just using audio, was revolutionary 4 years ago. And I think it's still very, very unique and still gives us a very, very strong value proposition when entering the market. We have been focused on clinical data, and we've gotten great clinical data now from 3 prospective clinical studies, which we require for regulatory submissions and regulatory approval. And we do understand that regulatory pathway very well. As an example, we met with the FDA back in 2016 as we were designing our studies to help us understand what they would require for approval. And we've obviously used that feedback in our study designs and our submissions. And we now have a CE submission and an FDA submission, both in with those agencies, with a CE response due very shortly and an FDA response due within a few months. Based on those, we'll also submit for TGA to come back here to Australia, and we'll also expand those initial submissions, which are for children, into adults relatively quickly. We are now on that cusp of commercialization. We've started our large business development push. We have a partnership with the German hospital group for a pilot study. We're talking to a number of groups in Europe, the US, and in Asia. As we get those regulatory approvals, we expect to move fairly quickly towards commercialization. And it's finally, we're no longer a single product company. When we started, we were looking at cough diagnosis for acute respiratory disease. We're now looking at management of respiratory disease. We're looking at sleep apnea. We're working with Lockheed Martin in the US to look at military health using cough sounds. And we're also looking at hardware and wearable devices as well. So we have a full portfolio of technologies that are coming to market over the next between 1 month, 2 months to 6 to 12 months, as you'll see moving forward.